I'm going to repeat the question.
The question is, doctor, what is the treatment of post-term pregnancy when you consider the amniotic fluid is normal and the fetal weight is normal? Okay, what is the treatment?
The first is prostates, management of prostate pregnancy. I didn't talk about it all. That's another talk altogether.
Okay.
But the first thing you need to know is really patients really prostates. Because oftentimes we don't have a good way to establish the due date. When I teach my medical students and residents, and I say, what is the single most important thing we do during prenatal care? It's to establish the correct due date. So that's the very first thing. We have patients all the time who come in with prostates, and when we look at their medical records, it wasn't established then. So once you have established the due date, and patients have gone past the due date, you have to look at other complications, high blood pressure, prior pregnancy. Let's assume everything's fine. In our hospital, we will induce if the Bishop score is favorable after 40 weeks. If the Bishop score is not favorable, we will institute by physical profile non-stress tests amniotic fluid at 40 weeks. And these are all patients who are totally normal with no other risk factors. And then many of us will start thinking about induction 10 days after due date. The World Association of Prenatal Medicine just published, we're going to publish a paper on prostates deliveries, and some people in Europe will go to 44 weeks because they feel that with everything being normal, there is not enough studies showing that it's unusual. But in our institution, we never go over 42 weeks. And if you have an inducible cervix, you should really deliver around 41 weeks.
Okay.
Can I add something?
Yeah.
Is that the Canadian post-term trial, which is the largest trial looking at the management of the post-dates pregnancy, showed that you actually, inherently, you would think that if you induce labor systematically at 41 weeks, you'd get an increased rate of C-section because you induce it as opposed to expectantly manage. But that trial showed that, in fact, because you induce a higher number of patients in the less than optimal condition past 41 weeks in the later group, the C-section rate was actually increased. So this data, which probably dates from 10 years ago, still applies today, remains to be seen. But I think, Dr. Gurov said dating is so important that a pregnancy that reaches 42 weeks with a good first trimester dating is extremely rare. It's rather rare. So 44 weeks to me is virtually unheard of.
Okay, but if you have a patient with IUGR and the score of Bishop is not good, and you don't use misoprostol, what is your opinion about the dinoprostone or the other prostaglandins to use the inductions?
I think one way to figure out what's going on to do what I told you is to do oxytocin challenge tests to make sure the baby tolerates labor. And once you've established that the baby tolerates labor well, you can use dinoprostone, but you should do continuous fecal monitoring. You cannot do it without continuous fecal monitoring. And if there's any sign of any issues, then you should do the investigation.
¿Alguna otra pregunta? Tenemos el micrófono. Vamos.
Tal vez Arturo.
Doctor y luego Mauricio. Listo. Bueno, hagamos.
una pregunta primero relacionada a la restricción de crecimiento. Que haya la sensación de que si uno tiene un retardo de crecimiento asimétrico, le puede inducir el parto. Me parece una contradicción. Si uno hace el diagnóstico de un feto pequeño,
un segundo, doctor, es que no está funcionando el...
Mauricio, no sé.
Which channel are you working?
Mauricio, ¿será que lo está trasladando? But I will try to translate the question that if you have...
Más sencillo entonces, 3 palabras. Creo que la restricción del crecimiento por insuficiencia placentaria, o sea, con Doppler alterado, es una contraindicación para la inducción del parto. Esos pacientes en principio van a cesárea electiva, o estoy equivocado.
Okay, you can use that now, but the question is, the IUGR with Doppler abnormal, do you consider it a contraindication to do inductions? Because the doctor he's not agree with the management of inductions in patients with asymmetrical conditions of IUGR and Doppler abnormal. Do you know what I mean?
So, just let me repeat if I understand the question correctly. If you have a patient with an abnormal Doppler, is that an absolute contraindication for induction? Is that the question?
Yeah, yes.
It's not an absolute contraindication. However, those are the babies that decompensate very quickly. So if you do an induction, you need to be very careful that you have a reassuring dressing and you be ready to do a C-section very quickly. But it's not an absolute contraindication for induction.
Okay.
Doctor.
Bueno, mi pregunta es la siguiente, con un comentario breve. Nosotros tenemos en nuestra institución la forma de hacer monitoreo fetal continuo y tenemos una central de monitoreo para este tipo de pacientes. Ahora, y así le colocamos, nosotros usamos misoprostol, usamos oxitocina, hacemos un monitoreo fetal continuo y basados en los parámetros del monitoreo fetal estamos tomando decisiones, que es lo que yo veo en la conferencia del profesor. Pero no escucho de pronto hablar sobre porcentaje de saturación de oxígeno, pH-simetría, los gases en el cuero cabelludo. Entonces me llama la atención, no sé si es que definitivamente ustedes ya lo abandonaron o por lo que uno lee en la literatura que no aporta más al monitoreo fetal continuo, a veces estoy inconsciente.
In the United States, we have very little experience with oxygen saturation, and we really feel very uncomfortable using it. Unfortunately, we have only one method, and that's fetal monitoring. And you need to learn how to interpret the fetal heart rate really closely. You need to know what variability means. You need to have all the same language in terms of decelerations. And other than that, unfortunately, we don't have much more going on.
¿Otra pregunta?
Dr. Ramos, what is your opinion about the use of venous ductus in assessment of restriction or another corpuscles in assessment of the restriction?
So the question is, what is your opinion about the use of ductus venosus and other vessels in the evaluation of these babies?
I think we reserve ductus venosus for other uses than IUGR. In our opinion, the same thing for MD and Dopplers. It doesn't have much use, at least we don't use it very much in our unit at all to manage it, to dictate the management of the IUGR baby.
In 1985, I went to a FIGO conference in Berlin, and Dr. Stuart Campbell, who was not the first to use Doppler, showed us a slide of late decelerations of nerve variability. And he said the Doppler, in this case, was a perfect Doppler, and he went back to sleep. What he tried to teach us is Doppler is superior to fetal heart rate. And I think since then, nobody's ever thinking that way. We still think that the most important status at this point is whatever you may think about fetal heart rate tracing. For the status of the baby in labor, specifically a baby which shows late decelerations, it's still the gold standard.
Eduardo. Acá está el otro, Eduardo.
Are you using STAN technology in order to best interpret the abnormal fetal heart rate during labor?
Yes, STAN technology is a computerized way to evaluate. No.
ST abnormality.
Yes, but it's a computerized way.
Yes.
We don't have it in the United States. It's not approved. I know it's used a lot in Europe. And when I travel in Europe, I talk to people about this, and they feel it's godsend. But I've since then, first of all, I don't have any personal experience with this, but when I read the papers, there are now more and more papers coming out. It's not as good as people think it is.
It's similar way to monitoring oxygenation with the scalp thing that you put in California. It was initially thought to be consent, but in the end it proved to be non-superior to monitoring.
Okay.
Question?
Mi pregunta ahora es, según lo que yo le escuché al profesor, los bebés que vienen perdiendo su potencial de crecimiento secundario a una insuficiencia placentaria y llegan a la semana 34 y aún tienen, digamos, un Doppler donde hay diástole umbilical, pero llegan a la semana 34 y se demuestra una maduración pulmonar, ¿es mejor terminar la gestación o ustedes esperan después de la semana 34 a que tenga ausencia de diástole para terminar la gestación?
I think this is an excellent question. What we do at Cornell is, after 32 weeks, at our neonatal intensive care unit, we feel that babies can safely survive with no complications. So if we have a baby after 32 weeks with absent and diastolic flow, with continuing IUGR, we prefer to deliver this baby. That's what we do. You need to figure out at your intensive care unit, how well they deal with babies between 32 and 34 weeks. But I think most people will agree that after 36 weeks, you definitely should go to between 32 and 36. It depends on your NICU. But our pediatricians yell at us if we wait longer than 32 weeks because they say we can deal with it.
Gracias. Quisiera saber qué opinión le merece el uso de los esteroides en aquellos fetos con restricción de crecimiento intrauterino.
We don't use steroids after 30 weeks. So if they're under 32 weeks, we do it even though we know that those babies are more likely to be stressed and less likely to have RDS. But there are other complications that can be decreased with steroids. And if they are under 32 weeks and we have time, we will do it.
No, I totally echo what he said.
I've got a question, okay? In the scenario, if you have an UGR baby and in the presence of hypertension or preeclampsia, what do you do? Especially if it is back from the term, expectant management or what is the condition?
By definition, pregnancy with IUGR baby that has hypertensive has severe preeclampsia. Right? So if you have preeclampsia and the vagus angina, it's by definition severe, no matter how high the blood pressure is. And then you have to go into decision-making mode. I have a patient with severe preeclampsia. What do I do? And the further away from terminal you are, the more you want to wait. But for most people, after 30 to 32 weeks with severe preeclampsia, they'll actually go to the patient. I feel extremely uncomfortable sitting on a patient with severe preeclampsia for too long. You might want to give ammonium sulfate. You might want to give Celestron and then 2 days later.
Yeah, if you look at the few studies that looked at the expected management of severe preeclampsia, IGR-ABs were excluded. So, and also there's a big difference between expected management and expected management. As Dr. Grunwald said, waiting 48 hours is, yes, it is expected managing the patient for 48 hours, but it's not waiting 3, 4, 5 weeks until the baby grows, because severe preeclamptic uterus is usually not a healthy intrauterine environment for the baby to grow, and you may do more harm than good by waiting. So I think delivery is the best option, sometimes 2 days after steroids.
Gracias. En nuestra formación como ginecobstetras nos enseñaron a manejar las cucharas de Velasco, porque se piensa que son menos traumáticas que los forceps. Para el profesor, su experiencia, si la ha tenido alguna vez con las cucharas de Velasco, y cuál es su opinión respecto al parto instrumentado con cucharas de Velasco. Gracias.
I think that's a very good question, and in 24 hours, hopefully, I can give you a better answer, because somebody will show me the Velasco spoon. It does not exist in the United States. I have no idea what you're talking about. I have no idea if there are studies proving it or disproving it. I'm pretty sure that your personal experiences are very good, but I cannot, in an educated way, comment.
Dr. Silva.
Okay, I would like to change the topic, but for me and for my hospital, it's very important the speech about the safe in the labor and delivery room. But what is your opinion? But how many people, how many doctors and nurses and residents is the ideal conditions to work in the labor and delivery room? Because we have hospitals around with labors and 300 or 500. I talked with Dr. Silvestre now, and sometimes we don't have the personnel, the people who works, and maybe they make a mistakes. This is good. We could be higher than.
When I talked about team training, and I want you guys to just remember the word team training. Part of team training is to teach all personnel, including nurses and doctors, how to manage their resources. Resources, how many people you have, resources, what is your equipment, do you have ultrasound. So we all need to learn along the way. There's ways to learn it. Let me give you an example. When we have always one attending in the hospital, 24 hours in the hospital, and they need to learn how to manage their resources. They have to make rounds on patients, they do deliveries, they supervise residents. So when you go into the operating room and you do a cesarean section, and you have some patients in labor outside, this is just one example. You may want to turn off your pitocin, because when the patient's on pitocin, you have an increased risk of fetal anomalies. And that's something people need to learn. You need to learn how to use your resources. Another way to use resources is that you have to spread out your inductions. You cannot do all inductions on Monday, Tuesdays, and Wednesdays, and nothing on the weekends. If you spread it out, it's important. But it's not an easy question to answer, because it really depends on each clinical circumstances. If things are not safe, at the end, you need to go to the source, directly to the source, where you get your money from, and you need to explain to them why it's not safe. You cannot wait and then be blamed for something, because at the end, it's the doctor who gets blamed when there's some bad outcome. And it's a persistent kind of thing. That's all I can say. People can teach how to use their resources in a wise way, but it's not always possible.
Okay.
Doctor Janus.
La pregunta mía va en relación a la anterior que hizo el doctor Acuña. O sea, en el escenario que tenemos preeclampsia severa y restricción del crecimiento intrauterino, en su institución, ¿cuál es la edad gestacional? ¿Cuál es el punto de corte que es mejor el beneficio dado la complicación por prematudez o por la misma restricción?
I think we have to look at all the parameters here. How high is the blood pressure? How small is the baby? How is the amniotic fluid? How are the Dopplers? In general, it will be 48 hours later, providing everything stays stable. Could we be a bit more generous if it's a 24 weeks pregnancy? Yes, we could in certain circumstances. We have to individualize. But in general, that's the case. The severe preeclamptics gets delivered and gets delivered quick because it's not a healthy environment. Does that answer your question?
I just want to say one thing. I agree with Dr. Sylvester. I never regretted delivering a baby where the mother had severe preeclampsia too early.
Okay.
But I did regret waiting too late. And it's something you need to remember, because at the end, the reason why you deliver is not the baby. It's the mother. The mothers are the ones who die of preeclampsia, of eclampsia, all the time. So you need to look at both patients at the same time. But at this moment, it's the mother that wants the intervention. And even after you deliver, it doesn't mean the mother is safe. So, and the longer you wait, the sicker the mother gets, the worse it is going to be for the mother. And saving 1, 2, 3, 4 days for the baby's sake might endanger the risk, the life of the mother.
Doctor Ramírez.
Muchas gracias. Mi pregunta va relacionada sobre qué factores, digamos, han encontrado en cuanto a mayor factor de riesgo para parálisis cerebral en estos pacientes o en estos bebés con restricción del crecimiento intrauterino, digamos, factores ecográficos, Doppler, y en cuanto a natural de bienestar fetal. Digamos, ¿cuál es el más influyente? ¿Cuál nos puede guiar para decir que estas pacientes tengan más riesgo de parálisis cerebral? Y la otra pregunta va encaminada a qué opinión tiene sobre los nuevos estudios que han salido en cuanto a neuroprotección social, en cuanto a manejo con sulfato de magnesio en estos pacientes.
Let me start with the last question first. The research on magnesium sulfate for neuroprotection is getting tighter recently. It's more clear. In last month, as we call it the Green Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology, and in the Green Journal there were some papers by Dr. Romero supporting the use of magnesium sulfate. There was a trial about a year ago in the New England Journal of Medicine also supporting it. So as we get closer to getting more information, we will be using, I think, over the next 6 months, introducing a protocol to use magnesium sulfate for neuroprotection only. In terms of predicting cerebral palsy, at the present time, we don't have much of a tool, but I know Dr. Asim Kojak is doing research right now, and it's going to come out hopefully soon, where he has a scoring system. He has several things he looks for, including biophysical profile, to predict cerebral palsy prior to delivery. Because as you know, we obstetricians are blamed when there's cerebral palsy that we did something wrong in labor. And he's able to predict prior to labor with more confidence whether the baby already has cerebral palsy. About 10 to 20% of cerebral palsy is because something we do in labor, and about 80% happens before. So at the present time, we don't have clear enough tests, but wait about a year or so and then look at the paper.
Una de las condiciones más frecuentes es en los servicios de urgencia las pacientes con amenaza de parto pretérmino, con cuello o cervicometría normal. ¿Cuál es en su institución el manejo para estas pacientes que llegan con contracciones uterinas pero no tienen modificaciones cervicales?
As I told you, I'm very much against tocolysis in general, and the definition of preterm labor, at least the one we use, is contractions and cervical changes. If I understand well, you're asking me if the patient is contracting but the cervix is not opening?
Yeah.
Nothing. Reassurance, we can observe her. You can observe her for 24, 48 hours in the hospital for reassurance, because sometimes they will declare themselves, frequent exams, but in general, nothing else.
Okay, but the patients in the emergency room, it says that she has contractions, and you made the ultrasound and maybe the cervical length is normal, but what is the treatment in this case? You decide to go out the patient to home or decide to use even tocolysis or?
As I showed earlier, no tocolysis has been shown to change the ultimate outcome, which is reducing morbidity and mortality, number one. And number two, I think there's nothing wrong with observing the patient, keeping her in the hospital to see if she will change in 6, 12, 24 hours. But I don't think there's any role for tocolysis in that context.
I use fetal fibronectin. Do you have fetal fibronectin in this country?
No.
So what I would recommend to do in those cases, think about reading up on fetal fibronectin, find out if it's worthwhile, see if somebody can bring it to your country. Because what I use in my institution, somebody comes in like this, I do fetal fibronectin, it's negative, I said no. The other thing is you need to look at the history. They had a previous preterm delivery, they have twins, you might treat them slightly different, even though the cervix is not changing. And I usually admit patients when they come the third time in 24 hours to the hospital, no matter what. So it's a general rule. But I agree with Dr. Solas that you need to be, sometimes you overtreat. And again, patients, there are reports of patients who died with vitiquinone and with magnesium sulfate. So they're both very strong and potential dangerous indications. And you want to have a good indication to give.
¿Alguna otra pregunta? Entonces, muchísimas gracias por la asistencia, se incluimos a los speakers. Nos vemos esta tarde en la inauguración del Congreso. Muchas gracias.